This video tutorial I will explain web service endpoint for create user and user related addresses. Here you can see users table. It has primary key ID, email of the user, email verification status, email verification token, encrypted password, first name, last name, and public user ID. And here you can see addresses table. It has a primary key ID and public address ID, city, country, postal code, street name, and type of the address can be a billing address or shipping address. And primary key of user table is linked in addresses table. So one user can have n number of addresses. So it is one to many relationship. Now we will see the example. Here you can see the web service endpoint for create user along with addresses, and HTTP method should be post, and the body should contain this JSON document. First name, last name, email address, password, and array of addresses. First address is billing address, and second address is shipping address. Here I have defined the class user controller, which is REST controller. It has a create user method which accept user details request model object, and this method consumes either JSON or XML, and this method produces either JSON or XML, and this method returns user REST object. And in this method I am checking whether email is empty in the incoming request. If email is empty, then it throws user service exception with error message. Then I am creating a model mapper object. Using map method of model mapper object, I am copying user details property values to user DTO object, and this method returns user DTO object that I am passing to create user method of user service object. This method is responsible for creating user information in the user and address tables, and this method returns created user DTO object, and using map method of model mapper object, I am copying created user DTO object property values to user REST object, and this method returns user REST object, and that user REST object I am returning back to the caller. Now we will see the class user details request model. The class user details request model has properties like first name, last name, email, password, and list of addresses, and getter and setter methods for these properties. And now we will see address request model class. It has properties like city, country, street name, postal code, and type, and getter and setter methods for these properties. Next we will see user DTO class, and here you can see the user DTO class. It has user related properties and list of address DTO, and getter and setter methods for these properties. Next we will see address DTO class, and here you can see the address DTO class. It has ID, address ID, which is the public address ID, city, country, street name, postal code, type, and the user details. and getter and setter methods for these properties. Now we will see about model mapper. Go to this site, and here you can see the information about model mapper, and this is simple intelligent object mapping. Click on get started. To use model mapper in our project, we have to include this dependency in form.xml file, and here you can see I have already included. Group ID is org.model mapper, and artifact ID is model mapper, and version is 2.4.2. And here they have given one example how to map source object property values to destination object. And here you can see source model is order, which has customer object and address object, and customer has name object, and class name has first name and last name, and class address has street and city. And here you can see the destination model, which is order DTO class, and it has customer first name, customer last name, billing street, and billing city. So from order object, this first name and last name should map to this customer first name and customer last name. And from order object, this billing address, street name, and city should map to this billing street and billing city. For that, what we have to do is we have to create a model mapper object, then call map method of model mapper object, and source is order object, and destination is order DTO. So destination we have to give us order DTO dot class, and this method returns order DTO object, which contains map property values from order object. And this is how we can assert that or verify that. Here also same kind of thing has been done. Here I have created a model mapper object. Then using map method of model mapper object, I am copying property values of user details to user DTO object. And this method returns user DTO object, and it has property values which has been mapped from user details object. Next we will see user REST class. It has user ID, which is public user ID, first name, last name, email address, and list of addresses REST, and getter and setter methods for these properties. Next we will see addresses REST, and this class has address ID, which is public address ID, city, country, street name, postal code, and type, and getter and setter methods for these properties. Next we will see user service interface. And here you can see user service interface. It has create user method, which accept user DTO object. And create user method is implemented in user service symbol class, which implements user service interface. Here you can see create user method, which accept user DTO object. And this piece of code, what I am doing is, I am checking whether the user is already there in the users table or not. If user is already there in the users table, then it throws runtime exception and message is record already exist. If not, then I am getting address DTO list from user DTO object, and using for each loop, I am getting each address DTO object from address DTO list, and I am generating public address ID and setting to each address DTO object, and also setting user DTO object to each address DTO object. Then I am creating a model mapper object, and using map method of model mapper object, I am copying user DTO property values to user entity object. And then here I am creating public user ID and setting public user ID to user entity object. And here I am encrypting the password and setting to user entity object. Then I am calling save method of user repository object and passing user entity object. This method saves user information in users table, and also it saves list of addresses in the addresses table. And this method returns stored user entity object, and using map method of model mapper object, I am copying stored user entity property values to user DTO object, and this method returns return user DTO object, and the return user DTO object I am returning to the controller layer. Now we will see user entity class. And here you can see user entity class, which is entity class, and this class is mapped to users table, and it has users properties like id, user id, which is public user id, first name, last name, email address, encrypted password, email verification token, and email verification status. And also, one user can have n number of addresses. So it has a list of address entity, and one user can have n number of addresses. So it is one to many relationship. So here we have put one to many annotation, and it has getter and setter methods for these properties. Next we will see address entity class. Address entity class is entity class, and this class is mapped to addresses table, and it has properties like ID. Address ID is the public address ID, city, country, street name, postal code, type, and user details, which is the object of user entity class, this class. And from address to user, it is many to one relationship. So we have put many to one annotation, and join column is user underscore ID, and in user entity class, we are mapping to this user details, which is defined here, which is the object of user entity. And here we have put cascade, and cascade type is all. So whenever we save user object along with user, addresses also will be persisted. And whenever we delete particular user, along with user, the related addresses also will be deleted. And for these properties, we have getter and setter methods here. Next we will see generate address ID method, which will generate public address ID. And here you can see the method which calls generate random string method, and this method is responsible for generating public address ID. Next, we will see user repository interface. And here you can see user repository interface, and it is repository, and it is responsible for CRUD operation. Here you can see the database org underscore db. Currently, it does not have any tables. Now I am going to start the application, and when I start the application, based on this user entity class and this address entity class, the users table will be created, and also addresses table will be created. Based on these properties, the columns will be created. Now I am starting the application in debug mode, and here you can see application has been started, and refresh, and here you can see users and addresses table has been created. Now I am going to create the user along with addresses, and this is the URL, and HTTP method is post, and in the body select raw, and here we have to select JSON, and here is the JSON document. It has user information and array of addresses. First name is Arun, last name is P, and email is arun@yahoo.com. Password is pass123, and it has addresses array. First address is billing address, and second address is shipping address. Click on send, and here you can see the request reached here. And here we got the output. Status code is 200 OK. So it is successful. And here you can see the created user information. Here you can see the public user ID, and this user has been created, and addresses also created. This is the public address ID. We can check in the database. Click on refresh, and here you can see the user detail is created. Go to addresses table, and here you can see two addresses are created. One is billing address, another one is shipping address, and the primary key of user table is linked here. Again send the same request. Request reached here. The record is already there, so we will get record already exists message. Here we got. In users table, there is one record is there, and primary key value is 1. For this primary key value 1, in addresses table, there are two records are there. And here you can see the primary key of users table. For 1, there are two records are there. You can get Java source code link for each video in the description section of the video. Here you can see the description section. Click on show more, and here you can see the Java source code links. Click on these links to get the Java source code.